On Perspective this week, we're looking forward to the June sitting of Tynwald. Later in the programme, we'll hear from Douglas North MHK David Ashford about housing, education and horse trams. But first, Douglas Central MHK Chris Thomas. Mr Thomas has several motions and questions for Tynwald, but he's also keen to clarify what's actually happening in Keys regarding the assisted dying bill. OK, Chris, spill the beans.
In the House of Keys, we've just finished our third sitting devoted to the assisted dying bill, and we've only done clauses 4, 5, 6 and 7. Now, that can't be right. I think that's signalling that we should have done this as a government bill, and we should have established the policy principles before we went to debating the legislation. Two other points about the assisted dying. The first one is that I think it's slowly dawning on Tynwald members, and I would hope that the public would realise this, that the bill before us is actually the making lawful assisted death and an activity around an assisted death. It's not actually making legal the provision of an assisted dying service. So the Treasury Act requires there to be a designated body to receive public funds. There is no designated body in this legislation. The Treasury Act requires public revenue to be used according to an approval, and there isn't a clause inside the assisted dying bill.
And of course, Treasury has to approve bills that have those provisions within them.
Yeah, so I pushed, along with others, the Minister about this eventually, because he wasn't actually the Minister for answering these questions, although I asked the Minister of Treasury, Dr Allinson. A letter was sent to all Tynwald members to say that it was going to be answered by Michelle Hayward, the member, because the Minister was conflicted. Essentially, it seems that Treasury concurrence has been given for the bill, but not to bringing the bill into force, and not for providing an assisted dying service. So the debate we had before TT about members saying it had to be provided by the National Health Service principles, by Manx Care or something, was completely irrelevant, because there's nothing in the bill as yet about providing an assisted dying service. The member moving the bill, who also happens to be the Treasury Minister, said it was premature. My question was actually about the cost of an assisted dying death, because in Jersey they've said that the cost of each assisted dying death is 23,600 or thereabouts. Multiplying that by the number of expected deaths, you get £1 million or so as an annual operating cost for an assisted dying service. And in Jersey, they've estimated it costs an additional £1 million to set it up. So I said, has Manx Care got a spare £2 million for all of this? And basically the answer was no, because there's been no discussions about that as yet. That's all premature.
Is it, though, Alex Allinson's fault that the services ended up being discussed rather than the principle, which is what the bill is all about? Well,
we'll never know his motives and his intention. Certainly in the Isle of Man we've made a mistake by having this as a private member's bill rather than a government bill, and certainly it's not good practice to have so much policy discussion while the bill's going through the House of Keys, and certainly the public has been led down the garden path, because I think they think as soon as this bill gets royal assent as an act, we'll have an assisted dying service. We clearly won't. And also, what the other things that came out in the Keys debate particularly were things like getting the approved substances, as they're now called following my amendment, to the Isle of Man is going to be pretty tricky, because drugs come to the Isle of Man through the UK, and if they're not lawful in the UK for these purposes, it's going to be pretty hard to get them here. We heard from the Isle of Man Medical Society, who haven't been involved in all of this, that they believe only one of their members will participate in this as a GP or as a hospital consultant, which is pretty troubling, and they believe it'll trouble other members of the profession. The other thing that emerged was there's no idea where this is going to happen. On the Manning line, a politician said recently, who people listened to, that he thought this was going to happen inside people's homes. Well, if that's the case, we're looking at registered medical practitioners going and spending hours with people's homes as they have a good death. Because having a good death is important, but we've got to have a system for that, and GPs are not exactly flush with time. You're lucky to get a 15-minute appointment in 3 weeks at the moment.
You're opposed to the principle
I'm not.
of the bill, are you?
In 2015 and 2020, personally, I can live with this, but I don't like leading people up the garden path, and I don't like pretending things are like they're not, and I don't like doing politics as a gesture. Essentially, I think the international media even thought we were on the verge of launching an assisted dying service, the first place in the Atlantic archipelago, and we are years away from that, and we are millions of pounds away from that. And we
effectively, if this bill eventually gets royal assent, all that's really going to happen, unless there are significant amendments, is the principle that assisted dying should be legal in the Isle of Man has been accepted.
Exactly, and what would happen next is negotiations would begin with Manx Care, or for another delivery pathway, to begin thinking about putting it in the Manx Care mandate, which takes a couple of years, or putting it into another pathway. And the other thing that's going on around the assisted dying is I've had now for 3 House of Keys sittings, I've had a motion to get a leave to introduce a referendum bill. That's not because I necessarily want a referendum on any particular issue. It's not really associated with assisted dying, but because the Chief Minister is moving for a referendum to be in what's called the commencement provision of the Assisted Dying Act. We need to have the proper referendum legislation. Our legislation is 1979. It's never been used. We don't even have the ability to set up a yes and a no campaign. We don't have the ability to limit the amount of money that's spent. We don't have conduct for referendum issues. So all the things that have gone wrong in referendums elsewhere around the world, we haven't got modern legislation. So my point is that the principles of what we need to do were set out by a man called Turner, who came over as a consultant. I took through 2/3 of the legislation that arose from his report, the elections and the registration of electors. The third one was cleaning up our Referendum Act and a few other things, and that's still to do. And if governments and the Crown Office are not going to be able to do it, I can do it, because eventually we will have a successful motion in Tynwald that will cause an election. We've been having calls for them since the first one was in 1981 by the late Dominic Delaney. Most recent one, I think, was mine in 2016. Eventually somebody will be successful. Dominic got 10 people supporting it out in Tynwald. I got 8 or 9, I think, back in 2016. Eventually somebody will get the magic number of 13 and we'll have to have a referendum, and at that point we need good law and good practice.
OK, well, I'd actually invited you in to talk about your Tynwald motions and questions, and indeed a general discussion about the Tynwald order paper. You've got, I think, 3 items on the Tynwald order paper.
One of my new motions is a similar one to the 3 that the Policy Alliance put down collectively in May Tynwald as well, because one of my 2 new ones is to publish immediately the transport decarbonisation review, which is long overdue. So taking the logic last time we spoke about this, already the Policy Alliance motions have resulted in the publication of the objective assessment of housing need, which is being debated properly in June. I've got this feeling that 2 more of the reports, one of which is Mrs Edge's motion, might be published before Tuesday sitting, and I've got this I've been promised on behalf of 2 chief executive officers of government that my report on decarbonisation of transport will also be published before Tuesday. So on that basis, we wouldn't move our motions, because what we were looking to get is to get objective analyses, studies published, so that the Policy Alliance and everybody else who wants to contribute to policy development and implementation can actually have sight of the same information.
And the actual title of the review, it says Strategic Transport Decarbonisation Review. Well, I can only imagine strategic transport must be things like how we get goods and people to and from the Isle of Man. How are we going to decarbonise the Manx boat? Are we going to introduce sailing ships again?
No. To be fair, the Manxman was specified inside a decarbonisation agenda, because it does have capacity for battery storage and so on. But you're right. It's about transport on and off the island, and it's also about transport inside the island. And again, I noted another item on the order paper for Tynwald is actually the policy decisions review, and that refers back to a motion I suspect you were probably part of 20 years ago about commuter travel. in the Isle of Man using basically what used to be termed the heritage railway stock. And that's actually closed off in the policy decisions report as having been done because it was covered in the Heritage Rail Sister review that I organised when I was in the DOI Minister. But is that really closed off? I don't think so. I don't think that's what you intended 20 years ago. I think you wanted to think about how we got around the island. So I'm intrigued to see what it says. I have actually already seen the decarbonisation review because it was available in draft 15 months ago or something, and at the time I said, I hope this is not the final version, because this just looks like to me like the same one that you've used for any town of 30,000 people surrounded by a hilly rural hinterland with a few coastal places. Some of the laws in here don't seem to exist in the Isle of Man. They seem to be English laws, so I'm hoping that the year or so's delay is because they've been tidying up the knowledge of the consultants and giving them some local data rather than just letting them submit the same one as they submitted previously in various parts of England. But I'm told that the Transport Decarbonisation Review and the Education Funding Review will be published by the time we get to Tynwald, so I might want to wait and discuss it when we actually see them again.
One view about Chris Thomas is that he's out for making mischief. He's full of reports, reviews and documents, and actually how does any of this help actually deliver the services that the Manx public need?
So, I mean, that is blatantly not true. So in my time as Infrastructure Minister, we didn't have a single consultation, national consultation. The only one we had was a very helpful local consultation on making practical the 20 mile per hour speed limit, which was a Tynwald resolution that hadn't been tackled for years. It is true that the Policy Alliance and yours truly are going to have to write things down lots over the summer, and those documents will say this is the current government position. We might even go and summarise where current people who might wriggle away from the government position would try to do that over the next 2 years. So, at the moment it's really interesting listening to Councillor Watson, leader of the Douglas Council Housing Committee. They have an excellent 10-year housing strategy. I can talk about it, but they don't really talk about it because they submitted it to DOI years ago and they're still waiting for a formal response from DOI, because we can talk away as much as we want about housing and the need for housing and the supply of housing, but until Treasury gives money to DOI to talk to local authorities about expanding the housing stock and modernising the stock, it's a bit pointless Douglas Council coming out and getting people excited about it. So that would be another angle for it. And likewise with Liberal Vannin, lots of the big ideas for government at the moment are were originally in the head of Mr Hooper. And he's an important minister. I often get the impression, as Joni Farragher sort of implied in her excellent interview, that the Chief Minister hasn't got the council ministers he'd really want and the policies that he'd really want. And Mr Hooper's an important part of that. He's a spirit behind the Manx Development Corporation and the Island Infrastructure Scheme and his approach to doing things. So I'm not into writing for policy's sake, but at the moment now we've got policy and policy development that's probably at its lowest since my time in politics, and that's why I'm so keen on the Policy Alliance. I'm so keen on us and others actually analysing the problems, what to do about them, and then presenting it by October, and watch that space for a useful motion that's coming up in July.
OK, so Strategic Transport Decarbonisation Review, once published, is just going to help formulate general debate and discussion. Is that how it's going to work, or is it actually going to deliver some real change?
I laugh, but it's pathetic in a way. Even in the Island Plan, the Strategic Transport Decarbonisation Review was due in September 2023. It's supposed to inform the Department of Infrastructure and Government's transport strategy, which is due by the end of this year, and we haven't seen the review as yet about one aspect of it, which is decarbonisation. So that's what's supposed to happen. The only other one that's even close to being as far behind is the waste strategy.
And the reason I ask this is because the Manx public want to see things happening,
and the Manx public is right. The Manx public is right. They're not fools. They're right. That's what's needed. That's why I didn't join government in September, October, because I could see what was going on as government was being formed in those secret meetings between the general election night and when the Chief Minister was elected. We weren't sorting out what we were going to do in the first 100 days. We weren't sorting out where the budget was going to be spent. We were basically having sort of what does the 24 people want randomly from their manifestos, and there was lots of fudges, and that's why the Policy Alliance is very important. So I'll just give you another example from transport decarbonisation. I went into infrastructure and said my two immediate priorities were making the buses run on time and better. That happened. TT was glowing success compared to what it was 2 years ago. And I began the huge process at the airport. Well, where we are at the airport is, as far as I can tell, we've still got problems at the airport with the regulator, but they're nowhere near as bad as they were. We've still got problems in the tower, but they're nowhere near as bad as they were. But when you come to read the Tynwald Policy Decisions Review about where Tynwald resolutions are in government terms, it closes off the one to do with air services because there's a strategic air services group set up. Well, that's not what the public want to hear. The public want to hear how we're doing on recruiting extra air traffic controllers and how we're doing on working with Loganair and with EasyJet and getting other providers on the routes. And I completely agree with you. The airport has got an ageing radar. It's got ageing facilities all over the place. We want to know actually how much that's going to cost to do it, and then we want to come up with a 10-year plan to fix all those issues.
And there are several items relating to housing. I mean, housing was undoubtedly the most important issue on the hustings. And we have a report which has 32 recommendations, and any seasoned Tynwald observer will tell you that if you've got more than 4 or 5 recommendations, chances are you're not going to get many of them through. 32 recommendations seems excessive. However, this is the report from the Select Committee on Tynwald Poverty, first report for the session, Housing and Homelessness. What do you think the motivation of that committee is?
That committee was set up in the last administration. They produced a similar sort of report, but not quite as much on steroids, as this one, about poverty itself and about income and social security. I can't see how I can even write my speech about 32 recommendations, especially when government is going to move to reject quite a few of them and to amend even more. It's going to be such an unstructured debate. So whatever happens, the Policy Alliance, yours truly, others need to write down exactly where we should be picking it up again. So that's how I feel about the debate. We can discuss particular recommendations, but in general, I think that's what we need to say at this stage, which is, let me go back to a previous debate that both you and I participated in. At one point, the DOI, when you were the minister, made a bit of a mistake by putting down too many options for things like the promenade and for sea services, and they ended up being amended on the floor of the House, and we ended up with a completely contradictory motion at the end of it. You've got to have an organised process with all stakeholders and with the public involved, and that's what I was actually doing in the DOI. I was moving away from consultations to calls for evidence from specific stakeholders so that we could come up with a rational response in certain areas. And to me, it looks like this report debate's got that characteristic as we have with the promenade and the sea services. It's a menu, and we'll end up with random, disjointed Tynwald resolution that will then need to be unpicked over the summer.
More from Chris Thomas after the break. You're listening to Perspective. David Ashford will be joining us shortly, but first, Chris Thomas. The chair of the Housing and Communities Board, who we shall hear from shortly, is moving that Tynwald receives the objective assessment of housing need, notes the accompanying forward from the chair of the Housing Communities Board, and acknowledges that Council of Ministers will submit a policy report to October 2024 Tynwald. That seems like a fairly innocuous motion.
Well, that's the best of the three housing motions. I mean, there's nothing really wrong with Rob Collister's. It's very simple, straightforward, but I think this one is slightly stronger than Rob's, because all Rob's doing is setting up a committee, and as we've just talked about, what people want is action, following decisions based on all of the information. So that OAN, Objective Assessment of Housing Need report, I started it. I worked with officers to approve the terms of reference. I never got a chance to meet the consultants, because just as I was being constructively dismissed, that was when the consultants were coming on board. And there are some There are some gaps in the report. So, for instance, mid-rent doesn't seem to be understood by the consultants. They don't seem to have the knowledge of the fact that we've got half our people on fixed-term tenancy and half of them not on fixed-term tenancy. They make the assumption that vacant properties, empty properties, are basically holiday homes like they would be in Cornwall without any evidence. And it seems to me there are probably other reasons why we have vacant properties on the Isle of Man that I needed to get inside. I think they make an assumption about older people and disabled people and pending occupation in commissioners' houses based on UK data, which, I think there probably could have been data if we'd gone about it. But at the end of the day, this report only cost £40,000. They've got it out. It's similar to the ones we've had previously, but they've been in various places. And I do welcome government now responding by October, and I've set myself the challenge of responding properly to that. There's only one weakness in Mr. Ashford's forward, and it's not a real weakness. It's just I'll be looking to make it more precise so it's not misused by other people, because there's a lot of misuse of the strategic plan going on at the moment. And David talks about these numbers informing the strategic plan. Well, at the moment we have a strategic plan that runs out in 2026. We have two variants of the future strategic plan, one in the north and west and Peel, even we're getting three. We have another one in the Eastern Area Plan, and I've got a question down about releasing strategic reserve sites. And then we've got the new one, which Mr. Ashford's words could be used to say that this objective assessment of housing need gives the new population targets and the new household targets in strategic planning terms. And I don't think it does, because it hasn't been through the whole strategic planning process. So I'll be putting down record that that's not the case when I do it. But I think it's a very useful document. And
just to clarify, Rob Collister has a third motion, which is the Housing Policy Select Committee be established. But would that not just do the same work as the Poverty Committee?
And he's been a member of the Poverty Committee, so there's obviously been a little fallout along the way.
Right.
But at least it's on a very specific thing. Mr. Collister has got a view about the eligibility criteria for social housing, public sector housing. He's got a view about the pointing system. He's got a view about the rents and what income and capital should be taken into account. And in a way, his motion and his committee will address the general point that both you and I agreed on a few minutes ago, which is it's on a very specific thing. I think it's likely that Mr. Ashford will respond, government's already working on that, and conceivably Mr. Collister will get really angry to say, you've been saying that all the time you've been in it, and Thomas was saying that beforehand, and I want now to go and chair a committee to actually go and talk to local authorities who'd provide housing, and to do my own select committee report with a couple of others and the assistance of the clerks. So, hey, I'll probably support him on that.
And of course, there's nothing to stop any Tynwald member doing their own investigations. And obviously, they don't get as much support, but they can.
And that's
and potentially affect. This is what your policy alliance is all about.
And you know that I spent hours going round in the regions talking to clerks and officers, and I have a good understanding, I think, of those crucial issues on prioritisation, on what would happen if we raise thresholds too quickly in terms of the supply. To go back to the objective assessment of housing need, that's all it is. I think to listen to the parties on the Manx Radio news stories today, I think the parties are a misunderstood need. I think they've jumped to the conclusion that if there's a need, there's a supply, but the supply, will only follow the sudden establishment of £100 million pot to start building public sector houses. Suddenly, the development policy to bring either holiday homes or investment homes or derelict homes or dilapidated homes back into use. There's a long way from need to actually supply, and that is a point that we tried to make to government from Housing and Communities Board and its officers 2 or 3 years ago, and it was falling on blank ears at that point. Well,
we are running out of time for your interview. The final thing then, you've got some questions down. There's one here in relation to the Isle of Man living wage. What's your concern with that?
Okay, that the living wage report is now published. The living wage between the last version and this version went up by over £1. The minimum wage went up by 70 pence. Government's policy is to bring the minimum wage to towards the living wage, but in the last 12 months it's gone in the opposite direction. There's a sister question from a colleague in the Policy Alliance, Ms. Christian, about the minimum wage impact assessment, which we also understand is produced, and it's certainly due. And so I think people are beginning to realise that in many sectors, the people who employ people are the ones who are beginning to suffer poverty and having to close down, rather than the people who are employed. And so, we need to go back to the Poverty Committee. In actual fact, it's the same Poverty Committee, the one that's produced 32 recommendations on housing, that came up with some recommendations in the last administration. And we need to go back and look at this on a broader basis. I've also got another thing about my questions, is that questions originate both in the House of Keys order paper last week. So unusually the President has allowed Keys questions that weren't asked last sitting of Keys to be moved to the Tynwald order paper. I haven't moved all of mine. I've moved some of them to the 25th of June if they relate to assisted dying. And also some of them that were held over from May Tynwald. So my first question is an starred question, as it's called, about public sector pensions, because I brought out in October 2021 a fundamental weakness of the Cannon government is his view is diametrically opposed to the Treasury Ministers, for instance, on the future of public sector pensions, and it's not really sustainable to have two diametrically opposed views. And we've now, I'm sure we've got the first 6-yearly actuarial valuation, and we need to know, at least the members of the scheme need to know what's going to happen to their pension contributions and their pension benefits. And I think it's a political question as well, because if by chance what that says is that as the deficit has gone down by more than $1 billion, and that members have been contributing too much, there's got to be an arrangement made for them to contribute less, according to the hard negotiated cost envelope arrangements. But I imagine that's pretty unpalatable if you're the Chief Minister and has been a long-term campaigner to close public sector pensions.
It certainly doesn't fit in with the public sector bashing that often goes on, particularly in run up to an election, where public sector pensions are deemed to be this huge drain on public
and there's
finances.
a huge misunderstanding amongst politicians, and I spent, as you know, it's probably my major achievement was to put the public sector pensions, sea services potentially on a better path in the last administration as Minister of Policy and Reform, and I'm not going to give up easily to let what the achievements that were made between 2016 and 2020 fall aside without understanding what you're doing, because Mrs. Lord Brennan, Mr. Cannon, Mr. Shimmons, Bill Henderson, amazingly, because he was working in Treasury at the time, had a losing position in the debates on public sector pensions, but they're now much more running the show. And to me, the debate on public sector pensions, indeed on everybody's pensions, state pensions as well, and we need to do stuff inside private sector pensions world that's been obviously needed doing for a decade. It hasn't been done as yet, and it's going to be a major issue.
Well, sadly, on the note that Chris Thomas says public sector pension contributors should pay less.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that was good. What I said was, if it was that way, they might. What happens inside the cost sharing agreement, the unions went for the standard 2% buffer. Government insisted on a 0.5% buffer against all the advice. We've got a 0.5% buffer, which basically amplifies the reduction in benefits and the increase in contributions. And I'm intrigued to know what the actuarial valuation is and then what the options are. And already it's public that there has to be a process with members, and that process needs to start now. It's already 6 months overdue, according to the PSPA published timetable, and it's going to start now because this question is going to stir it up.
That was Chris Thomas, MHK. David Ashford is also planning to be busy in June Tynwald. You have questions which we'll come to shortly, but also the objective assessment of housing need 2024, in which you're asking Tynwald to receive that assessment and acknowledge that Council of Ministers will submit a policy response to the objective assessment in October of this year. seems like a fairly innocuous little motion. Are you expecting it to just be nodded through?
I doubt anything gets nodded through, to be perfectly honest. My experience in Tynwald is the things that look innocuous tend to be the larger debates. And I hope there will be a decent debate around the OHAN. This has been much anticipated coming out. It's now out. It's now published. It provides an awful lot of data, which was the purpose of it in the first place, that will inform various things going forward, including the strategic plan. And, I hope that members will engage and they will have things to say on the OHAN. And, of course, come October, Council and Ministers will have a policy response as well, which then will also be debated. So it's a several-stage process with plenty of opportunity for Tynwald members to air their views.
And this is, I think, a very welcome aspect of Tynwald these days, that you do tend to have a kind of a pre-debate before the meat of the subject gets debated, which ultimately will be when Council of Ministers comes forward with some solid proposals and policies. And in a way, this is to maybe extract some views from members, to get a feel where members actually are, possibly also to allow the public to understand where we're at in terms of this assessment.
Well, I hope that the debate, when we reach it, be it Tuesday, Wednesday or Thursday, that Council of Ministers will take on board the views of Tynwald in informing the policy response. And I think that's the useful thing about doing something like this, because it is a big document. It is important. I said when I took on the role of Chair of the Housing Communities Board, if we don't achieve anything with housing in this administration, then we won't achieve the Ireland Plan, we won't achieve the economic strategy, because housing underpins everything. So it is absolutely crucial that we get the viewpoints of Tynwald members, and there may well be ideas and things that they put out there that haven't been thought of in this. So it's important that that is there and informing the policy debate. So I think it's the right way to do it, where you have the initial debate, where people can air their initial thoughts around the OHAN. Council and Ministers can go away, take those views into account, and then come forward with a full policy response in October.
And the public could be forgiven for saying you wait around for nearly 3 parliamentary years for a debate on housing, and then you get three for the price of one, because of course Rob Collister has his motion looking to set up yet another committee. A committee that he sits on has issued a report on housing and homelessness, which includes 32 recommendations. I suspect something of a record. And how, well, I don't know, we'll find out how Tynwald members are going to get their heads around all 32 recommendations in a meaningful way, and hopefully a debate that concludes without a whole load of hairs set running and people heading off in all kinds of different directions. Where do you stand on those other two housing debates? So,
taking the poverty report first, the work that the Poverty Committee has done is a massive piece of work. I've met with the committee, as have other members of the Housing Communities Board, so we can talk through all 32 recommendations. There are large areas where we agree on things. There are things where some things perhaps need to be nuanced, which we will discuss in Tynwald during the debate. And there's other areas where, again, there might be slight disagreements, but nothing massively. But it is, like I say, a massive piece of work that they've done, and it will be, I think, a very long and hopefully detailed debate, again with a chance for Tynwald members to put their views forward.
Chris Thomas has suggested that we'll end up with some of the recommendations being effectively thrown out. Some of them will be amended by Council of Ministers. What's your role in this? Because, of course, you're not in the Council of Ministers. You are the chair of the Housing and Communities Board, which presumably helps develop policy for Council of Ministers. How does this actually work? Because you're not going to be in Council of Ministers to discuss how they should respond to this.
So the Housing Communities Board does have 2 ministers sat on it. I can say I have input into this as well. So we do have the Minister for DHSC and also the Minister for DOI sat on the Housing Communities Board. They, of course, also sit in Council of Ministers. But if I have concerns or anything, I do have access to the Chief Minister. It is a Council of Ministers subcommittee, effectively the Housing Communities Board. It's a coordinating body. We will actually we've sent recommendations to council and ministers around this. We've informed the reports that have gone to council and ministers. We as a board, including the lay members of the board, have met with the Poverty Committee to go through one by one the recommendations, and Chris is probably right, there probably will be a mixed hybrid solution. I never try and prejudge what Tynwald will do, because it's normally a good way to be proved wrong, but there probably will be a mix of some recommendations approved as they are, some amended, and perhaps maybe a battle on the floor on others, but time will tell, and we'll find out next week.
And the other motion, of course, is Rob Collister looking to establish yet another committee of Tynwald. How do you think that's going to go?
I actually have sympathy with Rob in this regard. As a representative as an MH with my MHK hat on for Douglas North, which has one of the largest public housing estates on the island, Williston, I see a lot of the issues that are occurring in the public housing sector, and I actually think that in terms of his motion, I have a lot of sympathy for it. So we'll see how the debate goes on that when we reach Tynwald.
So, Rob, if you're listening, you've probably got one vote. Excellent stuff. You've also got a series of questions, the one or two that might be seen as parochial, but a few others may be less so. So let's start with the more national level questions, which are the ones you got to the Department of Education, the Minister for Education. What's your concern there about, I think is it excluded pupils and pupils that have had a troubling time in their education? What concerns have you got?
So this follows on from other questions that I've been putting down for the Department for Education, and it's starting to paint, from my point of view, a concerning picture. If you look at the number of pupils across our education system that are on modified timetables, which means they're not doing the normal timetable, there is some form of modification in, those numbers are going up. If you look at the number of suspensions of pupils who basically aren't in school, those are going up. If you look at the number of, I describe it as learning days lost. I know the Department for Education don't like that term. They prefer to actually say days of suspension, because they say that there's supposed to be support put in place for pupils who are suspended to still continue to work. Must say, from a constituency point of view, I'm not seeing that as a constituent representative happening. But I think it's having huge impacts now on our children's education and the education system across the island. And what I want to know is, firstly, does the department actually acknowledge there is a problem? And secondly, how are they going to deal with that problem?
And, of course, we know that the department internally does recognise there's a problem, because it had a bid of, I think it was something in the region of £8 million for support for that, the additional educational needs sector. I'm not sure. I think that was in the not this year's budget, but the year before. I don't think they got all the money that year, but they did get it this year, which is quite a substantial increase in that budget area. And this is to help children for a range of additional educational needs, but including behavioural problems. So the department internally has got this, but basically you're saying that they need to be a little bit more upfront with the public about this.
Well, I think they do, and I think they also need to have engagement with the parents as well. That's one of the key things from my point of view. I'm dealing with constituents where pupils are being sent home quite regularly. The parents are at the end of their tether in trying to actually get a solution to this problem. They're trying to help as well, but everything seems for me to be sometimes a bit siloed. It doesn't seem to be everything's working together, so I want to actually see from the department's point of view, how are they going to engage with parents to tackle this, because obviously the solution isn't just with the schools, the solution is with the home as well. How are parents going to be supported? How is the schools going to be supported? Because at the moment, I think this is going to have a huge impact on the next generation, both in terms of the educational development they've got and also the disruption that's going to happen to their lives later on, and we need to actually deal with it now.
As you know, it's relatively easy to put a question down. It's much more difficult to be in a position to give a meaningful answer. You will be aware that certainly the previous education minister had various disputes with unions to try and deal with, which had resulted in significant reduction in some of the extra curricular activity that teachers were willing to provide. There are a range of other issues. I mean, we've touched on budget. If you were the education minister, inevitably you would be struggling with this particular issue because of those constraints that we've talked about. How do you overcome this? And is there a sort of a weakness in the ministerial system where you're so focused on the job that's in front of you as the minister, so you can see where the solution is, and you can see that over the course of the next 18 months, 2 years, you're going to resolve this issue, and by telling the parents that there is the issue, you potentially make the issue a more difficult one to resolve. Is that possibly some of the complexity that's going on in the minister's head at the moment?
Well, I think one of the important things is that we are open and honest that there is an issue, because certainly from my point of view there is. I'm seeing it. The answers that I'm getting back when I put these written questions in are showing it. You're quite right. It's very easy to ask a question, but you've got to be part of the solution as well. I've sat both sides of the table. I've been a minister having to find the solutions as well as being a backbencher asking the questions. And from my point of view, it comes severalfold. There needs to be engagement with the schools, all of the schools together, so not as sometimes happens where you engage with one school here, one school there. Get the schools in together, find out the breadth of the problem that they're experiencing. Is there particular issues that are more than others? So, for instance, in terms of the suspension or modified timetables, is there particularly headline reasons that go across all the schools for these things happening? And then also go out, engage with the parents as well, and find out how the schools are engaging with the parents, because one of the things I'm starting to get a feel for is different schools are engaging with parents in different ways, and some seem to be having a bit of a better result and better approach than others. So we need uniformity in that. So I think that's how you start out and actually try and move things forward, because everyone's got to work in collaboration, the parents, the schools. And some of the parents I'm speaking to feel that they're not getting engagement from the schools. Some of the schools I speak to feel they're not getting engagement in some quarters from the parents. There's loads of frustration bubbling up. And I think that's what needs to be tackled head on.
Other questions that you have on next week's question paper include a question about the horse trams. Are you confident that we're going to see horses trotting with trams behind them all the way to the sea terminal before the end of this century, perhaps?
Well, I would hope before we celebrate the 150th anniversary, which is 2026, if my memory serves me correct. This was the decision of Tynwald in 2017. I was sat there at the time, so I remember it very well. It was actually pointed out that money that was being awarded also was to complete the single line track to the sea terminal. At some point that has changed, not by Tynwald, never come back to Tynwald to say that's a change. It has been done purely within DOI. So I have several questions down, 2 questions in fact. One of them to find out, when was that change made? Who made that change, crucially? Why it was done? But then also, we keep hearing, when things allow, we will actually consider it. Well, what does that mean? As you say, does it mean this century? Does it mean the next century? Does it mean in the next 10 years, the next 50 years? And also I want to know, because I know at the time the additional track was purchased. Well, where is that track? Is it being used for anything? And if so, what? Or is it just still sat around? And what kind of condition is it in now after the several years? Well, I mean, it's the front facing. I mean, people come off the sea terminal. Surely, if you're going to have a heritage offering, what you want is it front and centre of them when they come out of the sea terminal. Not say, well, if you walk up that way, past all the shopping centre and up, then you might get a chance to get on a horse tram. It goes from nowhere to nowhere, really, at the moment. But the will of Tynwald was very, very clear in 2017. That money hasn't been used for what the will of Tynwald was. So I want to know what DOI is doing about it, because at the moment there's just been really vague promises of, we've spent it now, that money's gone, bit of tough luck. When we've got some more, we might consider it.
A cynic might suggest that we were quite keen on active travel at one point. Maybe the active travel is walking from the sea terminal to the War Memorial. So you've worked off your dinner or whatever it was that you might have ate on the boat on the way over, and then you can get on the horse tram.
I think if people are going to do active travel, there's a lot better things they will probably find to be able to do it than that. The problem is you've got cruise passengers coming in. If you want them to get on the horse trams, do you really want to be saying to them, come out of the sea terminal, we'll either bus you up to the Villa of Gaiety or you can just walk up? As much as the weather sometimes is absolutely glorious, and we've had some recent glorious weather, also it can be pretty bad sometimes. You can't predict the weather when you're in the middle of the Irish Sea, and you really want to be saying to people, walk up that way and you might get a chance of getting on a horse tram. You want it front and centre of your heritage offering and your tourist offering if you're going to make a success of it.
Going back to your motion on the objective assessment of housing need, perhaps it would be helpful to understand what is it that you think the objective housing need assessment brings to the table, because Chris Thomas sort of challenged in the earlier part of the programme an element of your forward in which you were suggesting this will help shape the future of the government's plan for our island plan for the future.
Well, you should have the OHAN informing the strategic plan. The two should be interlinked. It would be very strange to have a report on housing required, potentially with different scenarios, and have it not inform a strategic plan. You can't, if you had the strategic plan going off in a completely different direction, then what was the point of having the OHAN and the data in the first place? The whole point of the OHAN, though, and what makes it a useful document, is it doesn't blindly just look at one scenario. It lays out various different scenarios around both population and need, and actually says, well, if you're going down this route, this is what will be required, or if you're going down that route, this will be what's required. Crucially, what the OHAN doesn't do is say this is what you should do. It is leaving the policy to Tynwald, to the government, to decide what is the right policy for the Isle of Man, but it's giving us the data of the various different scenarios. And one of the things that comes out very clearly with the OHAN, which is something that's within government's gift to be able to do, is around public housing, where we do need more public housing. That is something I was saying long before I was actually chair of the Housing and Communities Board, and it's something government does need to address head on, that the number of public houses is generally, with a couple of blips in certain years, but has generally remained pretty static for the last 20 odd years, but the population hasn't remained static, neither has the need. So government needs to certainly get a grip and start moving forward with that.
And apologies, I confused a couple of plans there. The strategic plan, of course, is a planning document. Our island plan is a series of aims and objectives set by this government. Of course, the difference between those two plans is the strategic plan. It was heavily consulted upon. There were loads of opportunities for the public to engage and to give their views, and the strategic plan, as a result, contained a lot more of the sort of the will of the people of the Isle of Man than perhaps it would have done if it had just been written by the Council of Ministers or an officer, planning officer. That process that allows the strategic plan to develop doesn't exist for this objective assessment of housing need, does it?
But what's crucial is the strategic plan itself is due for review. So that will all feed through again the review of the strategic plan. Because the strategic plan is also what is referred to when you have the area plans. So without trying to make it too complex a debate, obviously that therefore informs planning policy, which then informs housing, where it's built, how it's built, and what volume it's built in. So the strategic plan is due to come up for review. That will have public engagement, so the views of the public will most definitely be taken into account in the same way the last time the strategic plan was done. But what crucially we have is that OHAN as well. In the past, we've been really, let's be honest, putting our finger up in the air and thinking, well, if we build X amount of 2-bed housing, maybe that'll work and we'll get this. What the OHAN does is give us the data, gives us the different scenarios all in one place that will then inform the strategic plan, which will have public involvement, which will then allow us eventually to form the area plans as well.
So Chris Thomas, just trying to make a bit of mischief for you.
No, well, Chris. I think it's a good challenge. I think it's a good challenge back to me to actually turn around and say we'll have that debate, like I say, when we reach it on Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. I think it is a good challenge to turn around and say, well, actually, is this just actually saying this is the direction of travel, and we're not considering anything else? But I think I think it is important it informs the strategic plan, because the strategic plan is ultimately the legal document, let's be frank, that's going to underpin all of this. But the OHAN gives us the data and the different scenarios to be able to make an informed choice as to how we move forward.
That was David Ashford MHK, and we heard earlier from Chris Thomas. So what do you think? Is Tynwald making any progress on tackling the housing crisis, the highest priority at the last election? Will any of the debates help provide the housing solutions many people are still crying out for? Are we being led down the garden path regarding assisted dying? Will the horse trams ever get back to the sea terminal? Expect lively debates in June's Tynwald sitting. Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. For now though, I'm Phil Gorn. Go to Mayos on Geisach Rum. Thanks for listening.